Alright, so this is the next video in our ethics walking lecture series. This one's going to be on Immanuel Kant and his moral theory, which is often just referred to as Kantianism or Kantian ethics. And we'll go over a number of things in this talk. It'll include what the nature of the goodwill is. Number two, the difference between the hypothetical and categorical imperative. And then number three, the two formulations of the categorical imperative. Alright, so another brisk day at 30 degrees. Put my sunshades on. Let's take a walk. Okay, so as I've mentioned to you in other videos, Kant's theory can be filed under a deontological approach to ethics. And recall that deontology is contrasted to consequentialism insofar as A, the consequences are not what makes an act either moral or immoral, but it's something else. And that something else could be a number of things, and I'll tell you about, of those number of things, what's included in Kant's theory. So number one, as opposed to consequences, Kant thinks that intention matters in terms of assessing moral action. So, we've talked about this in other videos, to do the right thing, do you have to intend to do the right thing? Do you have to do the right thing for the right reason, or is it just a matter of achieving certain goals and ends? So for Kant, you do need to do the right thing for the right reason. Intention does matter, and that's what we'll talk about in terms of the goodwill. Another thing that characterizes Kant's theory as deontological is his emphasis on duty and responsibility. Got a little fan here, or maybe a critic. I guess he doesn't like the talk so far. So duty and responsibility are quite important for Kant. He thinks that we have certain obligations that we always have to adhere to, no matter what our personal desires are, no matter what we might stand to gain or lose from a certain kind of action. We have a general overarching obligation to act as rational moral agents. So actually, before I get into the part about the goodwill, I want to expand on this last point. So for Kant, being moral is being rational. In fact, he thinks that the moral law, this what we call the categorical imperative, a certain kind of test that I'll be explaining in this lecture about how we figure out or deduce what is moral. He thinks that the moral law is, an expression of rationality. So I've talked to you before about in the ethical egoism lecture about how before people start thinking about moral action, before they kind of make a decision to be moral, we might call them amoral. A is without, so they're without morality. It doesn't mean they're good, it doesn't mean they're bad, either one necessarily. It just means they haven't started thinking about it yet. So, why would a person start to think about this question? How should I be in the world? How should I act toward others? How should I treat other people? And for Kant thinks that the decision to be moral follows the decision to be rational. So, really, to make the decision to be moral, we must first have already made the decision to be rational. And philosophers put a lot of emphasis on rational thinking. We don't want to act arbitrarily. We don't want to act uncritically. We don't want to act unthoughtfully. Instead, what we want is, for example, consistency. We want to consistently act moral, and if we're acting morally for a certain reason, then whatever the reason is, we want to consistently adhere to that reason, rather than saying, on Monday, the moral thing to do depends on the consequences, but on Tuesday, it depends on the intention. For Kant, that wouldn't really be consistent, it wouldn't be rational. So, being rational, then, is the kind of first move we need to make. Am I going to be a rational agent? Am I going to make it such that my reason my sense of rationality is what motivates my action and what steers me in a certain kind of direction. So Kant thinks that we have to first decide to be rational agents, and only then can we really be moral, because what morality tells us to do is going to depend on what rationality tells us to do. Thanks, appreciate that. So for Kant, after we made the decision to be rational, we can then be in a position to figure out what the moral law tells us to do. And one of the things it tells us to do is the first thing I mentioned I was going to talk about, which is it tells us that we do need to do the right thing for the right reason. That intention does matter, because we've entertained cases before, for example, when someone finds the lost wallet but only returns it to the proper owner to be a hero or to get reward. And most of us think cases like that kind of exhibit examples of people that aren't really acting morally proper. There's something amiss. There's something that we're left with a kind of unsettling feeling about what they've done, if that was their intention, and nevertheless they return it to their owner, but only to be a hero. There's this lingering sense of, there's not something quite right about that. So Kant calls doing the right thing for the right reason the goodwill. And he thinks that in terms of morality, having a goodwill is one of the highest goods that human beings can achieve. Doing the right thing for the right reason. Acting out of a sense of moral responsibility because that is the right and rational thing to do. So, you return the wallet because you've thought critically about it, and you've reasoned, you've deduced that you have a moral obligation to do so. And here's how. Anytime you or I lose anything, anytime anyone loses anything of value to them, they want it back. They want it returned. It is your property. You own it. Perhaps you worked hard to get it. You have a certain economic value, like the cash money in your wallet, and maybe the wallet itself was given to you by your grandmother or something like that, or grandfather, and it has a sentimental value. So everybody wants their property returned. So one consideration is, if I lost my wallet, would I want it returned? And the answer is inevitably yes. Now, looking away from oneself, the rational moral agent asks, why would it be okay for me to not return this wallet, even though I would want my wallet returned? I can't have it both ways without risking being irrational. I can't say, I expect everybody else to return my wallet to me, and that's what I would want, and yet it's okay for me to keep this wallet that belongs to somebody else for myself. That would be an example of a contradiction in reason. Wanting your wallet returned, but not wanting to return someone else's wallet. And when you have that kind of rational contradiction, Kant thinks that's a sort of sign from, reason itself telling you ought not do this because you're acting irrationally. You're acting inconsistently. You're contradicting yourself. Now, to this point of the so-called golden rule, which you might think Kant's theory sounds like do unto others what you would want them to do to you, or you would want your wallet returned. In ethical thinking in general, and certainly in Kant's morality, it's not merely a matter of what you want. Like when I lose my wallet, and I do want it returned to me, but I think if you found my wallet, you should give it back to me, not simply because I want you to, but rather you have an obligation to. It is your duty, if you are a rational agent, to return it to its proper the wallet to its proper owner, in this case, me. So, when I lose my wallet, I don't merely ask, what would I want someone else to do? I ask, what would I think they have an obligation to do? What would the moral law tell them that they must do? And the answer is to return it. So when I find someone else's wallet, it's not the moral question is not what I want, do I want to return it to them, but do I think I have a duty to? Do I think it's my responsibility as someone who stumbled upon their wallet, do I think it's my responsibility to give it back? And if I think that you have an obligation to return my wallet to me, then reason tells me that I have an obligation to return it to you. Okay, so that's an example of what it means to think rationally and not contradict yourself, either in your intention or in the action that you end up externalizing. So for Kant, we have to do the right thing for the right reason. That is to say, we have to adhere to our obligation, and we know what our obligation is because when we think rationally, we are led to determine what our moral obligations are. So we have to do the right thing for the right reason. It's not going to be enough to achieve these consequences the way John Stuart Mill thought that consequences were enough. So we have to adhere to the moral law because we made a decision to be rational and we made a decision to be moral. We're looking at moral being as an extension of rational being, and therefore we must return the wallet. And Kant's got a kind of famous example that's misunderstood about a person who wants to do the right thing versus another person who doesn't want to do the right thing, but they both do the right thing. So two people find wallets. One of them really wants and has a sort of personal desire to give the owner back the wallet. The other person is, broke. They don't have money. They find a wallet with $300 in it. They could really use the money. And so they don't necessarily want to give it back because they could benefit by keeping it. So Kant says, if both of them give it back, give their respective wallets back to their proper owners. Look at this. Talk about finding a wallet. I just found $1. My good luck, I guess. The person that returns the wallet against their desire actually exhibits greater fidelity to the moral law because they didn't want to do it, and nevertheless they did their duty. They fulfilled their obligation. So it's a kind of sign that that person really did the right thing for the right reason because they didn't want to do the right thing in the first place. Okay, so that's the goodwill. Doing the right thing for the right reason, looking at moral action as an extension of rational thinking. Now let's talk about the second thing, the difference between a hypothetical and a categorical imperative. And this is pretty simple, it'll just take a minute. So for Kant, he thinks that we all have various duties and obligations, but what our duties and obligations are is going to depend on our particular position and where we're at and what we're doing. Now, everybody has a general obligation to be moral. Everybody has a general obligation to do the right thing for the right reason. But, soldiers living in a context of war have a very different set of obligations than a professor does. And you can imagine that for all the different jobs there are in the world, all the different posts that you could end up taking, that you're going to have different responsibilities. So too, we're going to have different responsibilities depending on, where we're at and what we encounter. So a hypothetical imperative is a moral obligation one has if one were in a given situation. So I might have a general obligation to never kill anybody, but that obligation might not be there if I am a soldier in war. In fact, in such a situation, I might actually have an obligation to kill another person if they were attacking my fellow troops, if they were attacking a military base that it was my job to defend. So if I'm a soldier, I have a certain set of obligations. But those obligations are contingent upon me being a soldier and having this social role. So it's hypothetical because it's if this is your goal, or if this is your end, or if this is your position, then you have these obligations. So what we contrast the hypothetical imperative to is the categorical imperative. And categorical means across the board, always. It's called categorical because it's sort of like, it exhausts the category. So, it's categorical because it's moral obligations that we always have. It's called an imperative because imperative means what you must do. So, the categorical imperative is the moral law. This phrase I keep using, the moral law, it's synonymous with categorical imperative. But that just begs the question, what's categorical imperative mean besides our obligations that we always have across the board? Well, Kant articulated what the categorical imperative was in two versions, which he calls formulations. So two different ways of saying the same thing. So we have the first formulation of the categorical imperative, which is called the universal form of the categorical imperative, and the second formulation of the categorical imperative, which is often called the humanity imperative. Now, the humanity imperative is easy enough to understand, so let's start with the categorical imperative, or the universal imperative. So, how did I recall a moment ago about how I was talking about figuring out how I know that I have an obligation to return the wallet that doesn't belong to me? So the universal formulation of the categorical imperative can be summed up. This is verbatim, so put this in your memory like I have. One should act only according to the maxim which one can at the same time will into a universal law. A mouthful, very Kant, very German, so let's unpack that. So, this term maxim. A maxim is a principle, a moral principle. You're familiar with the idea that actions speak louder than words, and that whatever we do in life, it kind of says something, it sends a message, right? So Kant says this: you confront or encounter a moral dilemma. You have to think about the possibilities of what you could do. What are my options here? What are my options in terms of action? And what do those actions say? They are usually underwritten by a certain kind of principle. So when you don't want to give the wallet back to its rightful owner because you found it, you can imagine that you'd be acting on the principle, finders keepers, right? That would be the principle. People say finders keepers, losers weepers. Finders keepers meaning I found it, therefore it's mine. Never mind that it belongs to somebody else and it's their property, they own it. If you found it, you think you can keep it. At least that's what the principle of your action would be, right? So Kant says once you identify a couple different options you could take, ask yourself what principle underwrites those actions, right? Then you have to ask yourself, would I be willing to take that principle and make it into a universal law? So now we get to the second point. What is a universal law? By universal law, Kant means a law that you think everybody should follow. So it's as if he's saying, imagine that you're kind of like a god. Not that you have special powers, but imagine that you are the rule maker for the whole world. Right? The whole world. Everybody at all times. if you were the rule maker that was making the moral rules for the whole world, would you make into a universal law finders, keepers, losers, weepers? Is that the kind of maxim, is that the kind of principle that you would be willing to say that everybody in the world had an obligation to follow? Now, to the point I was making before about desire versus obligation, so you're not simply asking, would I want everybody to return the wallet? Would I want them to do it? Is that the way I'm considering universalizing this law? The calculus is as follows. Would you obligate them to return the wallet, or would you obligate them to keep it for themselves? So want and obligation, as we were saying, are two different things. So you're not simply saying, would I want everybody to return the wallet, or would I want them to keep it for themselves? You're saying, this is what I would say they had a duty to do. They have an obligation to return the wallet or keep it for themselves. You can imagine already that the notion of saying that you have an obligation to keep someone else's wallet merely because you found it makes no sense. If we were casting it as a desire, then of course you might want to keep the wallet, and you can imagine that other people, particularly people who are in need, might want to keep it for themselves. But the calculus for you as the agent here is, would I tell them that they had an obligation to keep it? And that makes pretty much no sense, or it's not very compelling. So, the reason it makes no sense is for the reason we said before. Everybody wants their property returned, even you, as the lawmaker, as the rule maker for the world, you would want your property returned. So on the one hand, we say, I want my property returned, therefore Sorry, I got cut off there. So I was in the middle of explaining the universal formulation of the categorical imperative, talking about finding someone else's wallet. So remember, the calculus is, would I obligate everybody to return the wallet? Would I think that return property to its rightful owner is a maxim that I would be willing to universalize? And for reasons we've already discussed, we've determined that a rational agent would think that, because everybody wants their property returned to themselves, and therefore to want and obligate that other people return your property to you, but not to do it to someone else when you find their property, would be inconsistent, would be irrational. So, as the lawmaker of the universe, determining that there's an option to return the wallet that has this maxim, return property to its rightful owner, you ask yourself as a rational agent, if I was the lawmaker of the universe, would I say that that's a maxim that everyone should follow, that it should be a universal law that despite time and place, everyone ought to adhere to it? And Kant thinks that reason would lead us to say yes. And therefore, the sort of calculation of the categorical imperative tells us that we have an obligation to return the wallet to its proper owner, and that's what we ought to do. Now, of course, everybody knows that you or me or anyone else, and Kant knows this, that we're not actually the lawmakers of the universe, that no one is necessarily going to listen to you, and it's not really about trying to convince anybody. This is all happening in your head, in your rational imagination. And so you're asking, if I was the lawmaker, is this a law that I would pass? And he thinks reason would tell you in the case that we're talking about that yes, it's a law that you ought to pass. So that's how the universal formulation of the categorical imperative works. To review, step number 1, you encounter a moral dilemma. 2, you identify the possible actions you could take. 3, you ask yourself, what is the maxim or moral principle that underwrites these actions? 4, you ask yourself, which of these actions has a maxim that I would be willing to make into a universal law if I was the rule maker of the universe. And once you determine an action that has the maxim that you would be willing to universalize, that's the action that is not only permissible for you to do, it is the action that is obligatory for you to do. All right, to the second formulation of the categorical imperative, it's called the humanity formulation. This is very simple. Kant says this: the moral law tells us to never treat anybody else or ourselves merely as a means to an end. In other words, don't use people, don't instrumentalize people. Kant thinks that as rational beings, humans are free and have dignity. And that dignity, the dignity of human being, of rational agency, really needs to be respected. And we disrespect it when we treat people as a means to an end, as merely a means to an end. When I pretend to be someone's friend just to get the lecture notes for them so I can do well on the test, and I put a smile on my face and I suggest that I really like this person and respect them, but it's all really a ploy to get their notes or to use them for,